What a tranquil setting. You can hear the waves lap the shore, but today I want to look at the concept of philanthropy and the limitations of philanthropy. It's quite interesting. In a period where the rich and powerful are paying less and less tax legally, they're able to minimise their tax in many creative ways, as we've seen through the Panama Papers and other papers that have been leaked. We see that concerned about their mortality, they tend to set up philanthropic trusts. So instead of paying taxes so that everybody is looked after, what they do is they basically pick and choose particular issues they're interested in and support those issues in an attempt to ensure that their names live on forever, a little bit like the Nobel Peace Prize, and there are many other I could mention. So philanthropy is big business. Not only is it big business in terms of tax evasion and tax minimisation, it's also big business in picking winners and losers. So philanthropy is what's called a selective type of support for people and institutions that find themselves in difficulty. And the reason I'm a political and social activist is the fact that it's laws, that when laws are changed, everybody benefits, not just a select few. It's not about picking and choosing. It's a little bit like a social security system. The social security system was legislated for everybody, not just specific sections of the population. So philanthropy has many limitations. Now, philanthropy doesn't just occur for a concept that can be extended to the concept of charity. And every religious institution in this country and overseas talks about charity, giving a percentage of your income to look after those people who are less fortunate than yourself. So charity has always played an important role in the Christian philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and Muslim philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, Hindu philosophy. Because obviously through charitable works and good deeds, you kind of assure your place in the ever after, whatever ever after your particular religious belief promotes. But there is a problem with charity and philanthropy. I mean, myself and my late wife for over 40 years, and I continue, have been supporting somebody through World Vision somewhere in the world, mainly in Africa and certain parts of Asia. And over those 40 years, that contribution may have helped to improve an individual life or the life of an individual and their family or even their community. But the fact is, what we did is basically irrelevant because it hasn't changed anything. And that's the thing about charity and philanthropy. It does not change things. And what got me thinking about this topic was I've had a number of calls over the last few months from public interest before corporate interest, people who found out about the organisation and people who found out about public housing, everybody's business, and they've rung up seeking assistance to find housing. Now, I've explained that we're not a charity, we are a political community organisation which wants to change the political and legislative framework. So we don't need charities and we don't need philanthropists. And that's the difference. Although your heart may be in the right place when you're supporting a particular charity or a particular philanthropic trust, the reality is that the impact you make is minimal. Now, I remember a very famous statement and it was by Che Guevara. You know, somebody I've got a lot of political differences with. But when he came off the boat as the doctor for the Cuban Revolution, they had been ambushed, and there were people dying left, right and centre, and he had his medical equipment with him. And at that point in time, he had a choice to make. He could pick up an AK-47 and leave his medical gear behind, or he could take his medical gear with him. And in that moment, on the journey to Damascus, he made the decision to pick up the AK-47 because he realised, as an individual doctor, he would be able to assist through his lifetime a small number of people. But as a revolutionary, you know, somebody who's involved in social change and political change, if they were successful, they could improve the lives of the whole Cuban community. And that's what it's about. It's about making decisions about where you put your energies. Now, I'm also involved. I'm the convener for the West Papuan Independence Office Rent Collective. Now, that's not a charity. So that's a little bit different. The West Papuan Independence Movement is fighting for independence. They understand that the only way that the West Papuans will be able to enjoy the fruits of the lands they've lived on for thousands of years is to gain independence from the Indonesian colonisers. They understand that. Now, we could give money to individuals to improve the situation of West Papuans in a village here or there, or individuals within the West Papuan who find themselves in this difficult situation. But the West Papuan Rent Collective is basically there to provide political support, not charity or philanthropy, for the West Papuan Independence Movement. We raise the rent to pay the rent for the office, which then they use in the way they see fit. So it's political assistance, because unfortunately in our society today, most political and social organisations spend 90% of their time finding the money to do work, and about 10% of their time doing that work. By the West Papuan Rent Collective paying the rent on the building, what that means is the West Papuan Independence Movement can actually concentrate on the West Papuan independence struggle without having the concerns and the worries of raising the money to pay the rent. So it frees them. So if you are thinking of being involved in some type of overt political activity, but you don't have the energy or to be involved, this is one way you can actually make a difference, is by joining the West Papuan Rent Collective. See, most philanthropic trusts have tax deductions, and if you give to recognised charities, most of them have a tax deductibility. But the thing about the West Papuan Rent Collective is there's no tax deduction. People give money out of their pocket, not because they're going to receive a tax deduction or be treated favourably by the tax office, but because they're interested in that particular struggle. And that struggle is about improving the lives of all West Papuans. And that's the difference between charity, philanthropy and political and social struggle. Now, those people who ring me, because I'm a convener for public housing, everybody's business, and they ring me looking for assistance for accommodation, a little bit surprised when we say, we're not a charity, we're a political ginger group. We're there to raise the issue of public housing in the public mind. Look, we know your situation is difficult, if not impossible. There are many organisations that theoretically are looking after the homeless and people who are having difficulty paying rents and mortgages. There are a plethora of organisations, some religious-based, some not religious-based. The whole community, social and affordable housing movement is based on the concept of finding accommodation, not in the private sector, not fighting to ensure that the government of the day treats housing as an important social issue, not as some type of investment philosophy. And that's the problem. While we continue to rely on private investment for private profit, while we continue to rely on charity and philanthropy to try to capture all those people that have fallen through the social security net, and a social security net that has ever increasing holes in it because of government legislation, we will never be able to resolve anything. For example, supporting a child through World Vision for over 4 decades may have slightly improved the lives of that child and their family, but it has not changed the social political situation they find themselves in. So public interest before corporate interest is about ensuring that, one, ideas about putting the interests of the many, the public, are put before the interests of the corporate sector, that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's about putting the interests of the many before the 8% of Australians who have enough disposable income to take advantage of this country's investment-friendly laws in order to expand their wealth. It's not about piecemeal support. Obviously, there are individuals within public interest before corporate interests who are involved in charity work and philanthropic work, but they understand that this is not enough. This is just a stopgap measure. If you want to solve the problem of homelessness and housing affordability, you do that through political action. You do that through the change in legislation. If there's one thing the COVID-19 has demonstrated, is the fact that governments in certain circumstances have extraordinary powers. And that's why we see over and over again people who control wealth, we see them over and over again attempting to derail political action, because they know that once the legislation is passed, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to roll back gains that have been made. They know that. And that's why we have this rearguard action constantly, where organisations provide political support, financial support for political parties, who then say to themselves, why are we bothering? And that's the dilemma we have in this country today. It's not the fact that people are not interested in supporting their fellow human beings. It's not the fact that we've lost that ability to support each other, because we see that constantly through people giving to various charities. I'm not just talking about philanthropic trusts, but I'm talking about that individual charity where you're helping individuals. But we have now lost total faith in the political system. And nothing highlights this more than the ability of public interest before corporate interest to actually have enough members to be registered as a political party at the state level in Victoria, and possibly at a later date federally in Australia. People will tell you that they are disillusioned with the political process. They are disillusioned with the parliamentary process. But the disillusionment has reached such a critical stage that people are not willing to become involved in political action, whether it's parliamentary action or extra parliamentary action, because they believe there's no point, because the deck is loaded against them, that it doesn't matter what you do, who you vote for, how many strikes or occupations you get involved in, that at the end of the day, those who wield power and their representatives in Parliament will win on every occasion. The reality is very different. Human history is a history of radical change. It's a history of sudden explosions in popular sentiments, where people have become so disillusioned with the processes they find themselves in and their inability to have any say in those systems and to share the wealth created by that system, that pressure increases regarding change. And although most professional military forces in most sovereign states side with the government of the day, side with that small section that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange or communication, or the feudal monarchs which exist in the Middle East, other parts, or the authoritarian dictators which have been able to carve a place for themselves in particular sovereign nation states. The reality is that when push comes to shove, the change invariably occurs. And what public interest before corporate interest is about encouraging people to become involved, because without your participation, nothing will change. If there's one thing we've learned through history, it's active participation which eventually delivers the good. Medicare didn't come out of thin air, a public education system didn't come out of thin air, a decent infrastructure didn't come out of thin air, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme didn't come out of thin air, the social security system didn't materialise out of thin air when a fairy waved her wand or a wizard cast a spell. All these things which we take for granted today, which are part and parcel of life in this country, came as a direct result of struggle. Struggle which spanned decades, not struggle that began and ended within a 24-hour period. And unfortunately, in the 21st century, in the digital age, in the age where the digital media manipulates public sentiment, in an age of a 24-hour news cycle where everything is news and nothing is news and nothing ever changes, the fact is that ultimately it's still people that will make that difference. Philanthropy won't make that difference. Private charity will not make that difference. Legislation is what makes a difference. Inclusive legislation is what makes a difference. For example, in the public housing struggle, in Victoria, which I'm familiar with the figures, $7 billion plus per year is raised from stamp duty, which is levied on the sale of a home. That's $7 billion. If you quarantine, if the government of the day, through legislation, quarantine that income for public housing, you could house at least 100 to 120,000 people in the public housing sector for 25% of their income within a year. You could house 20% of the population within a decade. It doesn't require blood in the streets, it doesn't require revolutionary change, it requires a simple act of parliament. But there will never be a simple act of parliament regarding public housing if all the major players want the private housing sector, the speculative private housing sector, and the private housing associations, the community, the affordable associate housing to continue to exist. And as far as public housing is concerned, public interest before corporate interest is one of the few organisations which continues to promote the concept of public housing, a universal basic income, trying to accommodate the division between us and this country's First Nations people by taking the Uluru Statement from the Heart at face value and working towards implementing it by having more resources go into the public education system, the public health system, public infrastructure, publicly owned important facilities. But the last 40 years has been 4 decades where legislation has been passed which has tried to unwind all the gains that were made during the past 40 years through privatisation, through deregulation, through corporatisation, through globalisation. And unless there are people like us who are willing to raise these issues, who are willing to put these issues down on the political agenda of the day, we will continue to have to rely on charities and philanthropists to try to make the lives of those who find themselves excluded and marginalised a little bit better. As I said at the beginning, When Che Guevara had a choice as he came down that gangplank as they were ambushed, and over 70% of the men on that ship that came to land in Cuba were killed within a 5-minute machine gun spree. He had a choice. He could pick up his medical bag and provide limited assistance to a limited number of people through his lifetime, or he could pick up that submachine gun AK-47 and be involved in revolutionary struggle, which is designed to improve the lives of everyone. Now, I'm not asking you to put down your medical bag or take up an AK-47. What I'm asking you is to get involved in political action, political and social action, which will be used to change the legislative agenda. It's not an easy struggle. It's a hard struggle, whether it's parliamentary struggle, being involved in a political party that stands candidates and has policies which promote the interests of the many before the interests of the few, which promotes public action, or whether you're involved in extra parliamentary activity like petitions, strikes, occupations, protests, and the list goes on and on. Ultimately, it's those that are willing to take action, whether it's parliamentary action or extra parliamentary action, who determine the social, cultural agenda which determines the legislative agenda of Parliament. It's time that Parliament was no longer used as the plaything of that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's time that we put some real meaning into the word democracy. Even representative democracy can be made more democratic. Democracy is not limited to casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years and then sitting on your haunches and criticising because nothing changes. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, hopefully this tranquil setting of the birds in the background hasn't lulled you into a false sense of security. But ultimately, change comes through active participation. Without participation, there is no change. I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest today. Don't put it back till tomorrow. There's a federal election in the air, which obviously we won't be able to be involved in as a registered political party because the rules have been changed. There's a state election in Victoria in the air. Obviously, hopefully we'll be able to register as a Victorian-based political party, but ultimately we wish to be registered as a federal political party, and to do that we need your participation. We need you to join. Next week, who knows what we'll talk about, but hopefully the setting will be just as interesting as it is today.